we have Nancy Pineda-Madrid. We're not actually related, but we call ourselves Latino. And one summer, she convinced a group of students that we were cousins, so we were like the intriguing faculty on campus. But Nancy Pineda-Madrid, some of you already know, was a student of Alejandro García-Rivera. She's an assistant professor of theology at Boston College, and the recent author of this wonderful book called Suffering and Salvation in Ciudad Juárez, which is absolutely wonderful. And Nancy happens to be from El Paso, which according to Arturo Bañuelos is like the best, most wonderful thing in the
Arturo's coming in a little bit.
To add to that, we have Chris Tirres, the other wonderful person from El Paso, who's assistant professor of religious studies here at DePaul University. He was an HTI awardee and scholar, an Octus, the treasurer for Octus for many years, and saw us through some interesting years and wonderful stewardship of that position. So welcome to both of you. Thank you for agreeing to this presentation. And Nancy's going to go first, and then Chris.
Okay, thank you, Ana Maria. And I want to also begin by thanking Peter for inviting me. This has been really a wonderful opportunity to reflect with you and all of us here on Alex's work. And what I'm going to try to do is, I have a couple of reflections I want to make that are more personal, and then I want to spend just a little time looking at some of the roots in pragmatism, some of the roots that I see in pragmatism in Alex's thought, and I'm primarily drawing on the Garden of God. I wanted to, as I was thinking about today, to take the opportunity of today to spend time with this book and to see kind of the culmination of Alex's work over many years. I had the privilege to work with him. He was the director of my dissertation and really shaped my intellectual life in numerous ways. And this book that I just finished publishing is a great example of that, because a lot of what I'm doing here draws on the work of Josiah Royce. And Alex was the one who introduced me to Royce's thought. Alex, as we've already heard today, was a man of enormous vision. He knew how to see. And I think that just comes through over and over again in what we've heard. I questioned him once, asking, Alex, how can you, who are, for all intents and purposes, have attained a doctorate in physics, how can you still have, nonetheless, a predominantly intuitive and imaginative style in the construction of your theology, rather than an analytical and linear style of thought? And I was always puzzled by this, because I'd read Alex and we'd kind of circle these ideas, and I was like, okay. And he said, Nancy, he said, this is where you must understand math and physics, which are, at their most fundamental level, far more a work of the imagination than one of strict logic. They're creative works. Cutting-edge physicists, he argued, are intuitive wizards. And Alex knew, he knew that, and he lived that. He knew that theology was about knowing how to see. And in the words of Charles Sanders Peirce, who was one of Alex's mentors, I think Alex was really a man of abduction. Abduction is a technical term that Peirce uses to talk about hypotheses. He sees there being three different ways that we come to knowledge: induction, deduction, and abduction. And abduction has to do with developing hypotheses, coming to a flash of insight. And it's the idea of hypothesis, an emerging new idea that comes out of the rich soil of a time's intellectual moment. I think abduction really marked Alex's life, and I think that's largely what he lived, and what we see through all of his writings is that he knew how to see, and he knew how to see how to live inside the life of the mind in a very rich way that was always connected to the base. I can't begin today in sharing comments with you without a personal tribute to Alex. He was a man who called me into wholeness on a number of different levels. He often saw beyond what others could see, and he certainly saw beyond what I was able to see. Intellectually, he pushed me to go far beyond where I would have gone left to my own devices. I'll never forget the time, and I know Michelle's going to know a lot of these same memories, that he, in February, before the Octus meeting he was responsible for organizing, he comes to me, he's been told, you know, we need to have women. And I don't think he had a woman ready at that point to present. And so he asked me if I would present at Octus. Well, no doctoral student had ever presented at Octus at that point in history. And I remember just being overwhelmed with fear of, oh my God, I'm not sure I'm ready to do this. But I was more fearful of telling him no. So I went ahead, and that's just very typical of what he would do in his own general way. And he also nurtured my love of philosophy, introduced me to the pragmatist, to Peirce, Royce, and the whole tradition. Michelle and I had wonderful classes with Alex. We struggled, I will never forget, with Royce's. Royce wrote a book, Race Questions, Provincialism, and Other American Problems. And here he's talking about the American experience of the Civil War, looking at the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the implications of that for the Southwest and the way that so many of the Hispanos living in the Southwest at the time lost their property and lost their standing in society as a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So that book, Race Questions, Provincialism, and Other American Problems, when we were talking about it, it really helped us, I think, to see how even philosophy that is attempting to name and shape the whole can emerge out of a very particular context, because Royce was certainly working out of these historical moments. And Alex also, we took a class on von Balthasar with him, Theological Aesthetics. We read The Glory of the Lord, Ministerium Pascali, Presence and Thought, all kinds of different books. And I know he opened my eyes to seeing God in the experience of the beautiful. And in the process of that, that time that we had with him, Michelle and I, he invited us to present our work at the John Courtney Murray Group. And so it was a place where we were able to continue our work in terms of the pragmatists and looking at the connection between the pragmatists and U.S. Latino theology. He invited Michelle and I on several occasions to his house to critique his book manuscripts. He'd show them to us, and then he'd let us have at it, along with a lot of other students. And we were treated always to a wonderful dinner. Kathy would provide for us. So it was a very rich way that he nurtured our own intellectual lives in many, many different ways. And he also nurtured our spiritual journeys. We planned a number of Good Friday rituals, Guadalupe celebrations, Bible studies at San Leandro, which was really a lab for our work, as you've already heard talked about. And even in his dying, he taught me a great deal. I saw him for the last time on October the 10th of 2010, so just slightly over a year ago today. I sat with Alex and Kathy for about an hour and a half. We were at the Oakland Kaiser Hospital, and Alex was receiving chemo treatment. So I sat with him as the chemo was being injected into his veins. And I could see, as I was seated there, the pain that was racked across his face. He would never say anything, he'd never complain, but you could just visually see it. It was unmistakable. And yet he wanted to talk about theology and about the Teilhard conference he was organizing. And he wanted to talk about seeing and what we were seeing, even in the midst of this time that was close to the end for him. He knew how to wage a fight. He knew how to live in the midst of a battle with cancer, and he used even his experience with cancer to learn how to see even more clearly. At the end of his life, he lived in a very liminal space, a space that was, I was going to say between heaven and earth, but in a way that's not even right. He was living in heaven and earth concurrently. I think that's a more accurate way to describe what was going on. He had graced mystical experiences during that time where he'd have a community, much like San Martin with the cat and the dog and the mouse, but this time with family members who were living and family members who'd passed on many years before. And he would be conversing with all of them together. And Ana Maria has shared many experiences of that. So it's interesting that his seeing even moved to a very different level in the last weeks of his life. So I'm indebted to him for all of that. And I want to now just spend a couple of minutes talking a bit about some of the roots that I see in terms of his work and pragmatism. I think when we look at Alex and what he contributed, it's no wonder that he asked the question in the Garden of God, are we at home in the universe? Are we at home in the cosmos? He saw that there was a stunning loss of intimacy with the cosmos, and he saw an urgency around this question. We must, he argued, once again plant ourselves within the soil of cosmic awareness. And so what is theological cosmology? Well, Alex describes it this way, and I quote, "Let me suggest that a theological cosmology attempts to see God in all things. It makes visible the inner meaning of phenomena by allowing them to move the human heart. In other words, a theological cosmology is an aesthetics of creation. Like science, it pays attention to the phenomena of the universe, but it also attempts to see the inner meanings of all things. A theological cosmology, however, recognizes that for the human, there can be no detached observation. Phenomena proper to a cosmos moves the human heart. We do not simply observe, we participate." And I think that's a very important statement. We do not simply observe, we participate. And we don't choose to participate, we participate, whether we're conscious of it or not. And that's a very, very important distinction, because what Alex was aware of is that there's a unity, a spiritual unity in the cosmos that unites all of us. And we have varying degrees of awareness of that at any given point in time, but it's there, it's a given nonetheless. So where do I see a connection with pragmatism here? Well, Josiah Royce argues that Christianity is not just salvation of human, but the salvation of the origin and aim of the cosmos as a whole. Central to Royce's work is the seeking out of the metaphysical interpretation and foundation of community. And I think this sheds light on how Alex thinks about the fact that we're not simply observers but participants. For Royce, the central insight of his work was this interrelationship between community, spirit, and process. So when you study Royce, what you begin to see is basically a form of process metaphysics, but not a Whiteheadian version. It's a very different kind of process metaphysics, but it's certainly there in Royce and Peirce's work. And it's integrated through this idea of loyalty, meaning a devotion to a cause that we see as ideal, that's mediated through a real community, but yet that holds itself to some ideal in the universe. And Royce describes this in some very important ways. In The Problem of Christianity, which is his towering work, he begins by offering a response to William James. William James and Royce, of course, both pragmatists, but they would argue with one another. In fact, just about a couple months ago, I had never done this. I'm embarrassed to say until a few months ago. But I traveled to Cambridge to find their houses and just to walk up and down the street in Cambridge. And I realized, these two men had these homes that were quite literally right next door to one another. There's one home in between, and I wondered if that wasn't probably built sometime later. But they were very good friends, and in fact, William James got Royce the position he had at Harvard. And they would argue across the fence that separated their two homes. And Royce had a lot of problems with William James because he felt that William James focused on the individual to very much a detrimental effect, and that he understood experience in far too simple of terms. And Royce writes in critique of James, he writes this, and I quote, and this is taken from The Problem of Christianity. All experience must be at least individual experience, as James understood. But unless it is also social experience, unless the whole religious community, which is in question, unites to share it, this experience is but a sounding brass and a tinkling cymbal. This truth is what Paul saw. This is the rock upon which the true and ideal church is built. This is the essence of Christianity. So this social experience, this given that is, regardless of our degree of awareness of it, is what Royce devoted his whole life to trying to interpret and trying to grapple with. How do I explain this social experience? And I think that that's what Garcia-Rivera, he doesn't, in this book, very early on in the preface, he says, I'm not going to give you all the kind of quotes to his theoretical sources throughout, but I would say in reading this and knowing what I know of Royce and Peirce and studying with him, that there's a connection here that he's making. That for Alex and Royce, community had to be ultimately all that is in the cosmos, past, present, and future. That there's a spiritual unity that permeates the cosmos, and that was central. Royce saw God as the great interpreter, and that through God's interpretation of all things, all beings, that they come to be more fully who they are. And so God becomes the connection that links all together. And I think this is very central to what Alex is doing. That through interpretation, God can, and it's only a possibility, not all, obviously, not all interpretations advance this, but through interpretation, God can be seen as much more visible in the world. And it's primarily through interpretations that subvert evil that we come to see the spiritual unity of the world, and the cosmos becomes more visible to us. So that's one point I would make. The second point is to look at the question of pursuing truth and how Alex goes about that, and the reading of him. And I've kind of already alluded to this, to saying, when you read Alex in pauses, as Eddie mentioned earlier today. But one question that I've always had in reading Alex is, so much of his work moves forward with metaphor rather than the standard attempt at the pursuit of a precise articulation of ideas. That's not how Alex worked. And in asking Alex, in this book, he mentions that passionate words can get lost in a book too tightly concerned with scholarly details. And so he claims it's his intention to move the heart, first, to move the heart so as a guide to the mind. So theology for Alex, I believe, is a meditation on God. And in my judgment, I know Peter might have a different take, and Michelle on this, that he's very Baltasarian in this way, that this pattern of thought is so consistent throughout his writings that it frames all the theological claims that he makes, this kind of a meditation. He writes in a way that invites a sense of prayer and contemplation, rather than making conceptual clarity and precision the mark of his theological contribution. So what am I talking about here? Again, I want to go through an extended quote of his that I think illustrates this. And this also is taken from the Garden of God. Alex writes, Christ came that our mission be finally accomplished. He sent the Holy Spirit to renew the gift of our humanity that we may heal the trauma ever present in the universe together with Christ through the Holy Spirit. We are to restore Eden in the reconciliation of heaven and earth. We are to be reunited with God in Eden because God did not mean to stand outside of God's own creation, but to dwell in and inhabit it. God means to live with us in a cosmos that reflects and allows all creatures to participate in God's own goodness and life. Our ability to see a cosmos is our ability to experience God's presence in all things. This is not a pantheism. It is not even a panentheism. It is the garden of God. So then I like this very last line that illustrates what I'm getting at, that pantheism, panentheism, of course, would be much more technical terms, and yet He says, no, we need to move to a different way of thinking about this, and therefore using this metaphor of a garden of God. And there's a metaphysics operative here, I believe, but he doesn't name it as such, but it's definitely there, I believe. And where do I see this? Well, with Charles Sanders Peirce believed, and the pragmatists believe, that experience is ultimately our only teacher. So it's deeply, deeply, praxis is very much at the heart of pragmatism. And one way to kind of get at this is to look at Charles Sanders Peirce's Pragmatic Maxim, which I will read to you. It's a bit, I think it's a bit turgid, but I think but it does capture this notion of praxis. And this is where Peirce wrote this in his an article he wrote in 1878 titled "How to Make Our Ideas Clear." He took that very seriously when I read this. Yeah, how clear is clear? Okay, and this is the Pragmatic Maxim. Consider what effects that might conceivably have practical bearings we conceive the object of our conception to have. Then our conception of these effects is the whole of our conception of the object. Okay, so what does all that mean? Maybe I should read it again. Consider what effects that might conceivably have practical bearings we conceive the object of our conception to have. Then our conception of these effects is the whole of our conception of the object. Well, what Peirce is getting at here is that any kind of a conception that we develop cannot be considered in and of itself to live by itself in isolation. That it always has to be understood in light of the implications of that conception and the effects that it has in the world. And he sees this as very different from what William James was doing, because William James, so when you look at the pragmatists in the conversation here, William James was on a particular trajectory, and Peirce and Royce were on a very different trajectory. And in fact, Peirce was so upset, he was so upset with what James was doing that he said, you know, I can't call what I'm doing pragmatism anymore if that's what you're going to identify what you're doing, William James. And so I'm going to call what I do pragmaticism. So he changed the language here. And what's at stake here? Well, for James, a conception is true if all our experiments show that it is true. So it's very much a highly individualistic and utilitarian approach to truth. So is an idea useful? Well, it's useful if it works and it benefits the world in the way I see the world. The problem with that is that it breaks into a nominalism, which Alex was very critical of, and as well as obviously drawing on Peirce and Royce here. And Peirce argued that that's not the conception of truth, that the conception of truth, and this is what he's getting at with the Pragmatic Maxim, is a conception is true if all possible implications show that it's true. So it's not a utilitarian understanding of reality, but a realism that insists that separate things would not share properties unless there was some ontologically real universe, some connectedness here that exists that is preeminent. And I think Alex sees the cosmos and all of the implications I think what Alex is trying to do is to see that the truth has to be held in this cosmology as a whole, and how it is that we come to appreciate that. And he thinks, I believe, that a Peircean approach and this pragmatic maxim that takes seriously all possibilities of the effects of any given claim takes that seriously. And one of the implications of that, of course, is that truth, regardless of what we claim to be true, is always, always, always provisional, because we don't never know ultimately all the implications of a particular claim. And so because we can't know all the implications, ultimately the pursuit of truth is always provisional. So I think Alex advances in his cosmology, he's advancing a critique of James and embracing Charles Sanders Peirce's maxim, pragmatic maxim. And he does this through drawing on the genealogy, Alex's genealogy. You see certainly the marks of Duns Scotus in his work, C.S. Peirce, Josiah Royce, von Balthasar, and now more recently Teilhard de Chardin. And so I'll just end there. Those are just some very rough beginning ideas. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
My first encounter with Alex was through a letter. It was the late 1990s, and I had applied to the Graduate Theological Union to do doctoral work. A few weeks after having been accepted to the GTU, I received a personal letter of invitation from him. I was deeply intrigued by his discussion of a new school of theological aesthetics, and I was touched by the fact that he even took time to write this personal letter to me. In the end, I ended up staying on the East Coast to do graduate work. Fortunately, however, through the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians of the U.S., I eventually got to know Alex and many of his talented students, 3 of whom are sitting around this very table. I have been asked to say a few words and perhaps pose a few questions about Alex's engagement with U.S. pragmatism, an area in which I do work as well. Let me say up front that my work in pragmatism shares much in common with Alex's work, but it also diverges from it in certain respects. As for what unites our interest in pragmatism, one can point to our shared interest in everyday experience as a methodological starting point, a shared interest in offering non-reductive accounts of reality, and a desire to take the question of aesthetics seriously. As for the differences in our thought, I think much has to do with the fact that we were introduced to pragmatism in 2 very different scholarly settings. Alex was very much part of what I would call the West Coast, or better yet, Berkeley School of Pragmatism, where Peirce and Royce were 2 central figures, whereas I came out of a more East Coast / Cambridge tradition of pragmatism, where James and Dewey are especially important. When I read Alex then, I always feel stretched. He reframes pragmatism in ways that are at times brilliant, at times highly original, and yes, at times perplexing and elusive. As we all know, throughout his many works, Alex draws on the pragmatic philosophies of Charles Sanders Peirce and Josiah Royce to shore up what he sees as a promising, yet still somewhat deficient articulation of theological aesthetics in the work of Swiss theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar. And this especially comes out in The Community of the Beautiful. It's fantastic that we're making these connections now to his latest book, just to see how he's extended these conversations. As Alex explains in The Community of the Beautiful, theological aesthetics should encompass more than Alexander Baumgarten's classic articulation of aesthetics as the science of sensory knowledge. Rather, for Alex, theological aesthetics begs, quote, a more profound vision. What moves the human heart? This question, he maintains, quote, brings us closer to the mysterious experience of the truly beautiful, an experience that transcends geological space and prehistoric time. While Alex credits Balthasar for restoring the ancient theological insight that we know God best through beauty, he also shows how the semiotic logic and the metaphysics of relations developed by Peirce and by Royce can give philosophical clarity and depth to Balthasar's position. As one charts the development of Alex's thought from early to later writings, one sees that a third figure pops up in his pragmatic repertoire, and that is the voice of John Dewey. In his many mentions of Dewey, Alex speaks glowingly, yet Alex's appropriation of Dewey sometimes gives rise to moments of paradox and ambiguity. So I'd like to look at some of these moments. One such moment arises in Alex's retrieval of Dewey's understanding of the religious. As Alex correctly notes, Dewey separates out institutional religion from a naturally occurring sense of the religious, And today this discussion is roughly akin to the difference between when somebody says, I'm a spiritual person, not a religious person. The religious person usually has to do with adhering to tenets of institutional religion, Dewey's religion, while the latter speaks to an innate sense of spirituality within all human beings, irrespective of one's affiliation with institutional religion, Dewey's religious. Alex writes approvingly of Dewey's, quote, rather provocative thesis, which, quote, attempts an expanded notion of faith. Dewey's faith, Alex explains, is a faith open to something bigger than itself. For Dewey, faith, quote, points to a unity of the whole. If I had more time, I would develop this thought in particular, but maybe I could think more about this later. But I think we're coming back to this issue of the unity of the whole. What is ironic about Alex's use of Dewey here in this essay, this is from his Interfaith Aesthetics entry, is that he then immediately moves into a discussion of how this insight can be applied to Roman Catholic debates around the nature of Christian faith. Alex draws a distinction between Vatican I's extrinsic understanding of faith, which required, quote, the submission of intellectual and will to truths that God reveals to men and women, and Vatican II's more intrinsic understanding of faith, wherein faith is, quote, rooted in the historical experiential process culminating in Jesus Christ, who reveals to the human his and her very nature. In drawing this parallel, Alex seems to me to suggest that Dewey's own organic understanding of faith is akin to the vision of faith articulated in Vatican II. This parallel, I would argue, is correct, but only up to a certain point. Dewey would indeed eschew Vatican I's extrinsic view of faith as assented doctrine, but it is only partially correct, however, to assume that he would affirm Vatican II's more intrinsic understanding of faith. In other words, Dewey would affirm that faith is indeed rooted in the historical experiential process. But the mature Dewey would never go so far as to say that this process culminates in Jesus Christ. Thus, I think Alex overstretches a bit his use of Dewey here. This is not to say that Dewey couldn't, or indeed shouldn't, be reconstructed in such a way as to be applicable and relevant to institutional religions, Roman Catholicism included. In fact, my own work probes this very possibility. But what I am saying is that this kind of reconstruction requires a more explicit analysis of where exactly Dewey falls short in his analysis of institutional religion, and he does fall short, as where we may use his insights productively and creatively. A second and arguably more substantive tension between Alex and Dewey has to do with their understanding of the intrinsic or self-standing value of the aesthetic. And maybe this will lead us into some of our discussions on theological aesthetics. To put the matter simply, Alex is much more Platonic in his approach to beauty than Dewey ever is. Much of this is owing, I believe, to Alex's retrieval of Pseudo-Dionysius' idea of anagogy, which differentiates between a higher and a lower spiritual experience, and his fascination with Hans Urs von Balthasar's theological aesthetics, which holds that the aesthetic form is such that it radiates from within itself the very light illuminating its beauty. One can see Alex's indebtedness to Pseudo-Dionysius and Balthasar alike when, for example, he writes, "Whatever participates in beauty is beautiful and reveals something about God. The beautiful is a means for the soul to ascend to a blissful union with God." Alex's comprehensive entry on aesthetics for the Blackwell Companion to Christian Spirituality underscores his own Neoplatonism. Plato, Alex tells us, gives us a good account of beauty as an invitation to participate in the eternal. What I find so interesting here is that Alex goes on to argue that Plato, quote, offers no convincing account of beauty as a spiritual response by our humanity. Given this lack, Alex then turns to the thought of Aristotle. He observes, If Plato saw form with a capital F, Aristotle understood form with a minuscule f. Unlike Plato, who saw form as residing in a realm beyond experience, Aristotle sees form as the essence of experience itself. In other words, Aristotle believed that form and matter, the elements of concrete experience, were inextricably related. Form gave shape to matter according to some end that, in a sense, defined the nature of the concrete reality under construction. Aristotle's form does not enter the world of experience as a visitor from another world, but as the active shaper and mover of this world. For our purposes, this insight is significant because Aristotle's position here is very much Dewey's own. Aristotle greatly informs Dewey's aesthetics, to which Alex is highly sympathetic. However, in my reading of Alex's work, I am not always clear as to whether or not he makes this shift from a Platonic idea of form to a more Aristotelian one. I wonder, for example, whether his own choice to use capital B when describing beauty, or a capital M when describing mystery, doesn't belie a basic predilection for a more Platonic understanding of form. I also wonder how Alex would square Aristotle's and Dewey's naturalism, as seen in the insight that art imitates nature, with the more Christocentric aesthetics of Balthasar. Perhaps these are some questions that we could take up in the discussion. So, just two closing thoughts. Let me say first that Alex rarely closes off conversations in his writings. He borrows eclectically from thinkers, weaving a web that is greater than the sum of its parts, even if some of the individual threads may be in tension or at odds with one another. So two observations following this observation. First of all, at the analytical level, this means that Alex's method oftentimes cries out for more precision. And I think it would be a real loss and a real disservice to Alex, if at least some of us, some of his colleagues and friends, didn't continue to tease out the analytical questions that run in so many different directions throughout his work. So just as he wants to give a philosophical foundation to von Balthasar, I think that we would be doing him a service to help give some philosophical foundations to his work. I think that we can help cultivate some of the seeds that Alex has planted already. My second point, on the other hand, is that I also believe that we have much to learn from the thinking beyond the level of analysis and demonstration to thinking more inferentially, more speculatively, and more cosmically, as Alex does. As has been observed by so many of us, Alex carried out his intellectual work with the mindset of an artist. He had an uncanny ability to piece together discrete particulars into larger imaginative wholes. And yet, Alex was very upfront about the fact that many found his style of writing, quote, beautiful but imprecise, saying too much and saying too little. In response, Alex humbly says, to my critics, I beg forgiveness for bringing offense. Yet I believe wholeheartedly that we must begin to see the interconnectedness of the world even in our intellectual formulations of it. It may very well be that the inferential strength of Alex's overall intellectual vision greatly overshadows any particular cases of imprecision. Alex invites us to switch our thinking to another register, a register that Charles Sanders Peirce would call musement or abduction, a register of inference, hypothesis, and puzzlement. He reminds us that although the parts are important, we must never lose sight of the wholeness, the unity that unites them. In variety, unity. In particularity, beauty. Thank you, Alex.
So we have had two very rich presentations. It's open to the floor. You may want to ask a question, make a comment, an observation.
This is kind of a factual thing that I'd like to hear. Either Eddie may know, those of you who are students know. As a graduate student, he was already reading Peirce, and I think it was the semiotics that made the connection. But I don't recall him reading Royce or the other pragmatists at that time. Was this the influence of the John Courtney Murray group and Don Jelpy that led him into this?
That's what I'm wondering.
I would say yes.
Especially first.
Yeah, I think it's definitely Don Jelpy. He and Don Jelpy became very, very close colleagues very quickly, and they worked on a number of projects together. And Jelpy ran a seminar on the American pragmatists, and so Alex, at one point, was co-teaching that with Jelpy, and yeah, I would say most definitely that.
Because I don't recall that, when he was still in Chicago.
Right. Because really, Royce doesn't appear, I don't think, much in this book.
No.
Peirce does clearly,
Peirce does,
but not Royce. Yes, I think he got very much into Royce because Peirce, of course, is not really trying to grapple with ideas in terms of the Christian tradition, whereas Royce is most definitely moving that direction. And I think that the whole notion of salvation, the problem of evil, those questions, the way that Royce goes after them really intrigued Alex.
Well, and the concepts of community.
And community as well.
Yeah.
Very significant.
Thank
But
you.
I think it was a lot of Jelpy's influence.
Yeah, by the time that I was, and I came later than Michelle and Nancy, he was running a very specialized doctoral seminar inside his office on Royce. So we were, that's all we were doing. We were only reading Royce 24 hours. So, and Jelpy.
All Royce all the time.
And I think Jelpy was the connection to Peirce.
Well, let's say he was reading Peirce already as a doctoral student. We used to have the others not. So that's helpful for me just to clarify that. Thank you.
This is just a very technical question. I understood that we did woodwork. So how does that play into woodwork?
Oh, woodwork, yes, he did.
Do any of you know how that played into visiting the experience and to reality and that was an after.
Right, that, and he also was learning to play the violin. You all would share, right? And he practiced the violin.
I cannot tell you how it relates to the pragmatists because I don't understand. But he felt, I know that he always wanted to have a hand in some kind of actual material experience. Because he lived in his mind so much. Our kids would say, "Dad, will you do this?" He said, "I'm working," and he'd be sitting there. But they understood if he was in the woodshop building or if he was practicing music. And I didn't say he's doing it to get away from the kids, but I don't know. I think he just wanted to have his hands in the material world and think in a different way, and it made him think in a different way. I don't know if that answers your question, and I don't know how it relates to you guys. You tell me if it does.
No, I think both of them, both the woodworking and the music, relate very much to the aesthetic and to beauty. And if you looked, he took us into his wood shop. I went into his wood shop a few times, and Michelle, you may have as well. and saw a lot of what he was building there. And it was clear, you know, that it was about creating beauty, no doubt. So I think that was, he was living it on a very personal level.
Did you want to speak to that? So, Cecilia, did you go?
Yeah, I think it was also about, remember the influence of the Alejandro. And I think part of it was also like a practice of freeing yourself for a deeper state of interiority by the working with your hands. I think that was at play there. But I wanted to get back to the tension between the Platonic and the Aristotelian in Alex. He told me, and see, these are things he told me, and we're not in here. But after one lecture at GTU, he said, I don't know why everybody says I'm Platonic. I think I'm much more Aristotelian, right? And I think he was living in that tension. And then at one point, I said, well, give me a final verdict here on Balthasar. And he said, honestly, he says, in the end, I think he gets it wrong. And I said, why? And he said, because he places the glory of God there, away from here. So that was, I mean, a late development in him. I think he was, that the tension was moving him in this direction. So, and to the question of beauty, with the big B, I think lately, and I think he even, I mean, this is a textual quote, he says he's using it because it was another name for God. So that's why he's using it with a big B. So it's not so much the form as it's actually, you know, God's attribute, God's name.
No, it's just his comment about the physicality, the importance to Alex of being in touch with material, physical. To me, that speaks to, I mean, the people in my life, I think, who I have met and known who are the closest in temperament in the way they are to Alex are all monks. And that, of course, is part and parcel of the rule of St. Benedict, you know, this notion of the importance of physicality. And that is part of how one gives oneself to God. And we've been talking about how Alex embodied what he talked about. And that's part of that. You know, the importance of creation, the importance of physical existence, the particular. The particular is always concrete, it's always embodied. You know, it strikes me, and I'm a major sinner, how in the academic world there's so much interest in scholarship on the body and the importance of the body and this and the other thing, and always by people, for the most part, who care less about the body, who are living totally in their heads. You know, and Alex really lived it. I mean, he really took it seriously.
He also did bonsai.
Oh, yes, that's right. Yeah, that's right.
It's not a theological image, but the musician, the composer Lou Harrison, and this might be a distant connection, but he suggested that daily one should write music because you never know when the muse will visit. And so it's kind of the mundane practice of even rehearsing or practicing, you know, a musical instrument. You get lost in the moment, and then there's this epiphany. And so it's a broader spirituality, but I think it addresses it, even his interest in violin making.
Although he lied to you about playing the guitar, didn't he?
What?
Lied to you about playing the guitar when you guys first met? Didn't he tell you that he played it in a band or
Oh,
something?
he did, but that was a joke. No, I mean, no, he did play. The band was a joke.
You get these little insights.
Garage band.
Yeah.
This is just a general impression, but I just found it so energizing to hear both of you kind of take him apart and show us who his inner interlocutors were. because for some of us, when we saw him with his kind of outer interlocutors or communities or parish or colleagues, etc., sometimes some of that wasn't always clear to us. And so as I hear you both, it makes me think, wow, we have an exciting future. That there's a lot in those books.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Well, there's a lot in them, yeah. Absolutely.
You know, I think, Chris,
And-
that,
No.
I think that he would be really happy if someone would argue
Yeah.
with what he wrote, because I don't understand the details of the two philosophical points about form and so forth, but I know that he was really struggling with that. That was probably his biggest struggle in writing the Garden of God, and wondering how, because we're not talking about the science part, but he was really concerned about, I think, in thinking about that, how that religion science was going to view what he said there, because I think he was still slightly uncomfortable with it, but he just did it anyway.
I really appreciate the comment, and I have to say, just from a very personal perspective here, you know, in preparing and thinking about what I was going to say, an alternate start for me was going to be actually beginning with the first line from the Recordatorio that Ana Maria did and Cecilia did for the Journal of the American Academy of Religion. And as you tell us, the last one of Alex's last messages to his students and colleagues was, tell them that I miss our intellectual conversations. And I also sent him an email months before he passed away, and just told him that basically many things I told you here. You know, I thanked him for his friendship. It was great to know him. I'm sorry that we didn't have more time to talk about these things, but and kind of thinking through how I was going to do this, I thought, well, the best way that I could honor him is to point out some places that I think need some clarification. But then, even after I wrote those, I thought, well, you know what, Chris? That may not even be the point, because the point may be something far greater than that. And it's that inferential vision that I think. And I think many ways, you know, Alex, it's almost like his writing couldn't keep up with his thinking. Because he was always pushing new boundaries, new questions. The envelope was always opening up for him. And so I think, you know, part of the challenge in reading him is just trying to keep up with the rapidity of his thought. And again, coming back to it and saying, okay, well, how can we understand this? And if we need to present it analytically, you know, how can we do it in a way that both captures where he wants us to go and helps to build on some of the foundations that he's already begun to cultivate.
I'll keep Chris on the hot spot for a second. I mean, just in the spirit of kind of continuing the discussion, but not just looking at Alex's text, but in the sense the text he inspired or provoked us to write. I mean, the discussion about East Coast versus West Coast pragmatism can seem a little arcane, but when you engaged Alex on Dewey versus Platonism, that actually gets to an interesting question for me, and that is, I think that his choice of the anagogical imagination comes out of a certain approach to aesthetics, which is rooted in an ancient patristic practice. But it was also aimed at David Tracy. It was also aimed at a certain style of Catholic theology in the United States. And I just wonder what coming from Dewey more than Royce and Pierce, what is your take on the limits of anagogy, or that whole question?
The critique wasn't so much against his use of anagogy. I mean, from what I understand, he uses it to create a kind of difference between lower and higher. and a different kind of spiritual experience. I think that for someone like Dewey, the question so much shouldn't be couched in terms of lower or higher, but rather in terms of the intensity of the experience. So one of the other things that Alex was really drawn to was Dewey's theory of experience. And here I think we can really do some really interesting constructive work in this area, because Alex tells us that it really is about the organism in relationship to its environment. And it's out of this relationship, as we were discussing earlier, if we take the human as one of the most profound and one of the most elaborate forms of organisms, the question then becomes, through this interaction, what moments do you get of intensity that become aesthetic experience, and at the highest form, become religious experience? And I think Dewey was very open to that question. So I think from a Deweyan perspective, the question to Alex would be, can we rethink, not in terms of categories of higher or lower, but can we take it back to the question of how organisms interact with their environment in a place, in a cosmos, in this situation, and what are the qualities that emerge through this interaction? What are the qualities that emerge, and can we understand these qualities as aesthetic or religious? So it's not a spatial kind of way of looking at the question. It has more to do with emergence of qualities within this bounded frame of interaction. I think Alex would actually be very fascinated by that idea.
Yeah, but I can wait. No, it's just about the anagogical windows at St. Denis. When Alex would talk about those, the ones that were designed by Albert Suger, and he called them that, right? And Alex, I think, at least from what my understanding of this was, is that because of the coming of the light through the blueness, right, that the anagogy wasn't so much about a here and a there as about them being joined at that moment. So back to what Nancy said about Alex living in both places at the same time, that I think that's how he saw anagogy. That what Suger was trying to do with those windows was to bring heaven to that space. And it was about the intensity, exactly as you're saying, the intensity of the experience of those in that space, that the blueness was supposed to then, enliven and evoke. So, so I think it's very material in the windows, in the reaction, and in all that. So I don't think he sees it as, you're just going to go into an interior space where you leave Earth and it's all over, but rather that it's brought to.
This kind of continues it, I think, in a different way, or in another way. And this kind of goes back to your point about the Platonic and the Aristotelian. It seems, at least from my reading of it, so much, in many ways, Platonic. Again, as you were pointing out, the anagogical reaches back to the medieval and even the patristic understandings of aesthetics, as opposed to the modern, which shifts more to the patterns of the perception of the perceiver and what's going on in terms of the person who's gazing at or listening to the art. And he talks, about his sort of dissatisfaction with Kant and with Schiller and so on that. And, I wonder if the question then is so much Platonic versus Aristotelian, because in some ways I see his turn to the pragmatists as looking for another way to look at the modern, rather than the traditions of transcendental idealism that have kind of ruled at least the discourse in aesthetics, you know, over a longer period of time. But it was an incomplete project. You know, I agree, but I don't know if you have any comment.
No, I think that's right, and I think, you know, when I guess what I especially wanted to highlight that I think Alex saw lacking in when he brings up the distinction between Plato and Aristotle is just the active dimension, the human dimension, the interactive dimension that I think he sees missing in Plato. But I think you're absolutely right that that the pragmatic tradition becomes another way to think through this question of aesthetics, and framed that way. Actually, I think Dewey is picking up on a very kind of medieval idea that it's really the experience itself that is aesthetic, not so much our individual psychologizing of the experience, but it's what gives rise within nature, within this frame, that gives rise to what we call the aesthetic. Of course, Dewey's a naturalist and bounded that way, but I think that there are parallels there.
And kind of from a very different angle, retrieving that.
I've never thought about it that way, but I think that's right.
And, well, I just wanted to add, you know, I think Alex was trying to do precisely that, because he wrote at one point an article on beauty as a source of religious insight. You know, so he was looking at like the Roycean question of sources of religious insight and making an argument that if Royce had added looked at other additional sources beyond what he did in that book, that beauty would have been another way to go based on kind of the Roycean thinking there. So I think that's one place where that connection's explicit. And I don't remember right now the title of the article that he wrote that does that, but I know he did explore it. Maybe I don't know if you guys know. Do you know that article?
Do you know the article right now?
The title of it.
If just a comment that comes, when we finish, you know, this afternoon, you know, how we're bringing this together, moving it forward. Has anyone, or did he leave a pretty complete list of what he had published? You know, Kathy?
Well, we got a Neil Obstadt, so there's a list somewhere. And that wasn't very long ago, so maybe, I don't know who compiled that for him.
And I asked for his CV from the school for the article I wrote for the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, and it was Alex's haphazard put together CV, but I don't think it's in any way comprehensive.
If he did it, it would have been
Well, I think that, you know, if we're talking about where his legacy is going, this would be a very important. I worked on the thing with Skillabakes, you know, that he had kind of kept some, but we had to do a lot of research, you know, to find things that he had forgotten that he had written.
Would there be anything in the JSTV files that could be unlocked for us?
Who did you ask?
I asked Bruce Lesher, and he sent me Alex's last CV at JST.
Yeah.
So the one compiled by him that had his list of publications. And like I said, I could see it was incomplete. But it's very interesting because it's almost like annotated. He's got like little comments on things, not just listing it. Yeah.
Because I wonder, the one that Kathy's mentioning for the Neil Obstadt, that if they have that on record, but since it wasn't as up to date as this, but maybe this wasn't as up to date as you had hoped.
Right, well, because he has major things, but he's got a lot of especially journal and articles like that, they're not in there at all. And at one point he came to me with, I think it was like a bag full of stuff. And he said, and of course at that point I'm writing my dissertation. And he says, well, you may want to look at this at some point, you know. It's like, oh my God, Alex. So, which I didn't have a chance to do other than just quickly. So, do you know where that bag might be?
There are boxes in our basement, so.
This is a good thing to note as we're proceeding. Thank you. You're falling into one of those contemplative moments. Yes,
I've got a question again, particularly to ask those of you who have worked with him in the aesthetics or have looked at it closely. some of the stuff he had written made, sometimes he'd talk about aesthetics, sometimes he'd talk about theological aesthetics. And towards the end, they kind of merge again. And it seemed to me, just going back to our exchange here a few minutes ago, when he was talking theological aesthetics, the Platonic was really clear. On the other, it was less so. Do you have any, maybe Cecilia, Michelle, Nancy?
Well, one of the things that he wrote in the article, The Color of Truth, which is in the Arts Journal, he said theological aesthetics is two things. So he says it's a doing, so it's actually the creative works that somehow mediate profound religious insight to the community. And he says, and it's a method to look at those works. So he says it's a doing and it's a method. It's the two things. He does also, at the beginning of Wounded Innocence, he critiques the idea of aesthetics or philosophical aesthetics as being very incomplete. And so he thinks theological is the completion, that it's the needed next step for aesthetics to actually have something profound to say. So I didn't really ever hear him separating aesthetics out in his own work as another thing.
Just two pieces that really kind of helped me see the other side to Alex's work besides the theological. One is that it's pretty thick, 30-page or so entry on aesthetics in the Blackwell Companion to Christian Spirituality. And then there's a very interesting article on interfaith aesthetics, which they did for the Festschrift to Sandra Snyder's, I think.
Oh, yeah.
And so there he's I think he's using more categories of spirituality rather than drawing specifically on the Christian tradition. But I think that in itself is a really interesting piece to kind of look at and to compare what he's doing, say, in the Garden of God, which is very much.
I wonder if the notion of gift doesn't move it from aesthetics to theological aesthetics. That is, that the beauty as gift, you're no longer then limited to the human experience of the human being, but it is a receiving. And I don't know whether, probably from Balthasar to a certain extent, but there's a lot of Jean-Luc Marion and other people working on this whole question of gift. And that also bridges, I think, the Platonic and the Aristotelian, this notion of gift or beauty as kenosis. So it's both in other words, it's a receiving, but a receiving here, now, in the particular, and in the doing.
I wonder, Michelle, if you have any, did you want to add to this program? It's okay, just was me.
Well, just to affirm some of the things that have been said, in attending the conference on Beauty is the Color of Truth, it enabled me to kind of rethink Alex's kind of understanding theological aesthetics. And I agree with what has been said about his attachment to the idea of theological aesthetics. But two things that struck me at the time, and now I think loom even greater significance. One is that the emphasis on color of truth was very much Alex's contribution. And seen against the trajectory of modern science, Galileo distinguishing between primary and secondary qualities and the diminishment of the color of truth in the modern era. That got back into the science project. That got back into how to look at the natural world. A kind of aesthetics that was taking seriously nature, but at the same time subverting the normal ways we think about nature. The other point was that I hadn't really, up to that point, known about his friendship with Ron Maccassoni, and that the influence of interfaith aesthetics on his work was at that point something very new to me. And I saw him going in a completely different direction than when I had originally got to know him in 1997. And that element, you mentioned it here, it seems to me very important to understand what he learned from Asian art and from the conversation with Ron is very important for this concept of this.
I have a question, just thinking about the discussion. And I can, again, preface my comment by saying that I didn't know Alex and so on, but here's just to get at some of these issues from another angle. I just like to put the question out there, and thinking about this and admitting that it's a little dichotomous to think of it like this, would people regard Alex more as a theorist or an anti-theorist?
I think you'd have to say a little more of what you mean by theorist and particularly anti-theorist.
I think anti-theory would stress more and work more in terms of just description. Description of what is before oneself. And less trying to conceptualize how one arrives at descriptions, for example. I think of like with Wittgenstein, he talked a lot about colors, and I think he tried to do that to get modern philosophy out of epistemology, basically. And because on the one hand, I feel like there's a stress in materiality, and on the other hand, very theoretical person. I think Dewey, especially James, are trying to get out of theory in a way. And I just ask that because I find it a tension in my own thinking and how much one should try to say what one is doing, or you should just do it. And in the academy, I think it's an occupational hazard. And again, I might go back to my comment this morning. I think in some ways we have this gnawing sense of trying to get out of the realm of high or complex theory or articles where you're trying to untheorize things, but it turns out to be a theory that way. And it's just kind of... I mean, it might be a non-starter.
Well, no,
that's okay.
I think it can go someplace. And I think it kind of comes back to his whole turn towards the pragmatists. Perhaps an intermediate category here, if you can use a word like that gets theorized already. He's an inferentialist.
Mm-hmm.
He works out of inference, the abduction. It's not like doing transcendental idealism, where you only lose points if you hit ground.
Yeah, right.
I don't think you ever entirely escape theory.
No.
Except perhaps in silence. But I would say, he was much more inductive in the way he moved into things. But he was constantly bouncing it off the theories that had been already articulated. And that's why he kept, it seems to me, moving in different directions. And like I said last night, he couldn't touch a method without improving it, fiddling with it in a way that, a lot of scholars don't. And I mean, actually making some real improvements. He certainly did that with his work in semiotics. He made it more usable, more replicable. That's the major problem with semiotic theory. It's non-replicability. We all did a semiotic analysis of the same thing. We would have as many different schemes coming out as people participating. And I saw particularly his capacity to teach it, because when he was teaching in your summer school, he'd tell me about, how he was using this. And he was saying the Latinos picked it up much, much faster than the Anglos. But I'm kind of rambling now. So.
One thing you said reminded me that probably all heard was, the saying, oh, that's great in practice, but how does it work out in theory?
No, about in the mid-90s, I attended the first meeting that the sociologists of religion had in Germany in 20 years because of this big row between Thomas Luhmann and Nicholas Luhmann. And part of what brought it together, they both agreed to come to the meeting, but not on the same day. Well, in the discussion, this sort of came up. They tried to have a panel at the end. Well, these professors weren't used to doing that. They each wanted to give a lecture, and then one of them was talking about looking at data, and a professor did get up and say, "Now that's all well and good to collect data, but what if it contradicts the theory?" And I started to laugh, and I was the only one laughing. The story's too good. I just
Thomas Kuhn.
Let me turn back to Chris and Nancy in case you want to say something at this point, and then there's the two on the floor.
Well, I would just concur with the whole notion of Alex being much more of an inferential thinker. I think there's enormous theory operating underneath everything he does, even though it may not be overtly explicit in his works, but it's definitely there. So there's much more than simply description going on.
And I would just simply add that two things. As regards the pragmatist and James and Dewey, I think they're both doing inductive and deductive reasoning. So they start with experience and the real problems that exist in the here and now. But what they're doing, I think, is they're offering a method of thinking about experience that can potentially change experience for the better. So you start with experience, but you have to take it through the ringer of making sense of what's going on here. What are the background theories? How can we use philosophy to bring critique to bear upon the situation in order to change it? And I think that relates back to what has been said already. I think in Alex, as I like this, the inferentialist, I think he is right there, but I think that he's really moving in both directions, both the inductive and the deductive. And that's what's so fascinating about his work, is that he starts with the little stories and ends with the cosmic garden. And I think maybe one question for us is, how do we come back to the little stories? How do we understand the relationship between the little stories and the cosmic garden? So that's a gift that a present that he left for many of us to continue to think about.
And there's Dominic and then Bill, and then Dan.
I fear mine's a bit of an oversimplification, but Mike, you made me feel that I could ask the question.
Yeah, well, my question was pretty obscure. So.
No, what Chris sort of inspired me. In a way, this is a question again as a newcomer. This is my role. So is the implication that he's the great visionary, the great artist, and the details are left for others? I mean, like a great artist, he does something so wonderful that he's given us something that's so latent with value and meaning that we're left to sort of, how do we get from, how did he make that beautiful image on the canvas, and how do we get from point A to point B? Is that the implication?
That's one possible implication. If you're more analytically inclined and you like to make those connections, I think some of us can do that.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing that I wanted to stress is that I think he's also challenging all of us to get away from the theological and philosophical training that we've been doing for so many years, which is taking things apart.
Mm-hmm.
And the challenge is, can we shift the register to think about putting things together in a much more inferential, inductive, hypothetical way? That's the bigger challenge, and that's the harder nut to crack, I think.
Very helpful.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you all could relate this to, when I hear Latino pragmatism, I automatically think of Gustavo Gutierrez and the way that Latin American liberation theology in the 60s, 70s, 80s was kind of rethinking the theory praxis idea of matrix and trying to put praxis first and so on. And that's different from, I'm just wondering if Alex or anybody else has done work kind of relating that to what American pragmatism do. I mean, it's different in the way that it's not just taking experience and reflecting on it as a secondary step, but praxis is not experience in some ways. It's something that's more active. It's a sort of political doing that one then reflects on. And I'm just wondering, it just seems odd to me that we're talking about Dewey and Peirce and Royce and not talking about Paulo Freire and Gutierrez and so on. So I'm just wondering if anybody could kind of
I'm working on a
address
book
that.
on this question.
Oh yeah? Oh, good.
Freire comes into it, and Gutierrez comes into it, and many people around this table come into it. So it's...
You guys should be colleagues or something.
Yeah, Chris didn't pay me to ask that question. Well, can you do a plug for your book then?
No, I do want to add though, I mean, separate from these discussions that, in philosophy, right now the question of pragmatism and Latino and Latin American and issues of identity, there's a lot of interest in this area. And so I think that what we have within the U.S. Latino theology and the work that you've done, the work that Bob LaSalle Klein has done on Charles Sanders Peirce, obviously Alex, the work that you're also working on, Ceci, I mean, I think that's really right for just opening a number of other questions on how pragmatism fits into this matrix. I think your question really is this matrix of praxis. And how do we move from this category of experience to experience and praxis? And what are the implications there?
Yeah, so what's your answer to that question? Or how would Alex address this, or if you would want to address it, like what are you going to argue in your book? I'm interested in.
Well, Dewey is central, and I think that Dewey is kind of the most praxis-minded of all of the classical pragmatists, and that's one of the reasons that I'm drawn to him in particular, and relating him to issues, larger discussions of liberation thought. As to the question of Alex, I think Alex is he's really about the moment, the moment of disclosure. I read that much more than the moment of praxis or transformation. He really wants to plug into how does this moment of mystical experience, of beauty, how does that point to the larger question of beauty in the cosmos? And so I think the next question after that is, okay, well, what do you do with that moment? And that's the difference between Alex being more Peircean, perhaps, rather than being more Deweyan. Because Dewey would ask the question, okay, you have this moment of beauty. How can you begin to use the instrument of the mind to expand this beauty? And so that you have multiple expressions of beauty. That's a question that I'm interested in.
Well, there's a sense in which, for some of the Latin American figures, it seems to me that the moment doesn't come until you're already involved in the praxis,
right.
And then the moment comes. Then the kind of revelation comes from the doing. In a sense.
I think there are several moments of revelation that we're going to use that word. I mean, I think Dewey would be the first to say there are moments of just natural givenness. There are moments of beauty that are just gratuitous. The experience of being in community, the experience of standing over the Grand Canyon, the experience of love, the experience of music, color. Those are all aesthetic moments, powerful aesthetic moments for Dewey. But those aren't the only type of aesthetic moments that we can have. It's exactly what you're saying. When you put those aesthetic moments in the context of social engagement and being together, working together, using our mind, using our intelligence, how can we then gain new forms of aesthetic experience through that sociality? So that's just pushing the question further. So actually there's multiple sites of these aesthetic experiences. And I think somebody like Dewey would say, well, even in Latin America, even before the social activism, there's the aesthetic gift of life. I mean, the fact that you're still going, and there's something very beautiful to that as well.
The two colleagues will have plenty of future possibilities to continue
Yeah, but
this
sorry.
conversation. But we have like 5 minutes left, and there are two more that we'd like to ask for comments. So Dan and then Rebecca, and then we'll break for break.
Yeah, this is just a basic question, but I'll ask it since there was talk before about the sources that Alex was using. And I wonder if anyone knows who he was reading, or I imagine it should be who, not if, who he was reading in philosophy of science. And I ask because the abductive model, or hypotheoretical deductive model, as it's sometimes called, is very important for the philosophy of science, but I know that it's also helpful to show how religious ways of knowing and scientific ways of knowing parallel each other or interconnect in a lot of ways. So I just raised that question. It might be interesting to see.
Well, all I can say is that Oleg Vyshkov is going to present on that at the AAR. So he's been looking at that question on the science question. But in Garden of God, Alex talks about some of his major influences in that area.
Okay.
The other thing perhaps to add, Peter told me Philip Hefner was invited, but wasn't able to come.
So there was a reading group with Robert Russell, right? That was a big source of...
And before that, Alex, as a grad student, was very closely working with the Zygote Institute.
Yes.
Ralph Burho, and very much concerned with the parallels between religious knowing and scientific knowing.
So Rebecca, I'll end with you today.
It's just, I don't know, I'm just dazzled by what you two have done here, and it's really helped me to understand what I've always found difficult. I'm trying to understand Alex. What makes sense to me, though, is what he says, that, what moves the human heart. And that's kind of something that he continually says. And so I just wanted to ask you that phrase, which is very, it's a metaphor, it's ambiguous, it's French, and putting it in something philosophical, or I don't know, just respond to that. What moves the human heart, because that was, to me, what really, calls out to me. I'm going to talk about that in my talk. I was going to answer.
There you go.
So is this for future things to come? Well, thank you very much to both of you for very rich